Okay, good afternoon. I'm on about a 5:30 flight, so I'll give you as much time as I can, but I may need to leave a little bit earlier than normal. But as you know, I just returned from a busy period of international travel, which included APEC, the East Asian Summit, and of course the G20. These events provided New Zealand an opportunity to exchange views with the most influential players in the world on critical issues like trade, the global economy, security, and other matters that affect our prosperity. They also provided a great opportunity to promote New Zealand as a great place to do business and to invest in. I was pleased to announce over the weekend that we have concluded negotiations on a free trade agreement with Korea. Korea is New Zealand's sixth largest export destination for goods and services. This agreement will enhance our strong relationship with Korea and will set the scene for an even closer relationship into the future. It was a privilege to host German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper in New Zealand last week, and I'm looking forward to welcoming Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday. As you know, our relationship with China is strong. China is now our largest goods trading partner. I'm looking forward to discussing with President Xi how we enhance the trade, economic and cultural links between our two countries. As you may have seen today, we've outlined further support to help combat the spread of Ebola, an issue that was discussed at G20. We will facilitate the deployment of up to 24 New Zealand volunteers who will rotate through 6 to 12-week stints as part of the Australian flagged mission in Sierra Leone. The government takes its responsibilities to these volunteers very seriously, and ensuring their safety is our paramount concern. In addition, we will also provide a package of assistance to Pacific countries to help them prepare for an Ebola outbreak. New Zealand's total funding for the international response to Ebola now stands at $5 million. Today, Cabinet discussed whether or not there should be a wider inquiry into the Philip Smith incident and the events leading up to his leaving the country on November the 6th. As you know, the Department of Corrections is undertaking an urgent internal inquiry into this matter. There's also a multi-agency review underway which will look at how information between agencies is shared. However, we feel there is a need for an independent inquiry separate to the departmental process that is taking place. So today I'm announcing that there will be a government inquiry into the Philip Smith incident. This will be established under the Inquiries Act. Establishing this inquiry will not preclude those departments' reviews from continuing. Those reviews will be able to feed into this broader one. But given the gravity of the situation and the need for the public to be satisfied that everything is being done to ensure their safety and that prisoners are being properly managed, an independent inquiry reporting to a minister is necessary. For this inquiry, the Minister responsible for State Services, Paula Bennett, will be the responsible minister. Terms of reference for the inquiry and other details, such as who will head the inquiry, will be taken to Cabinet next week and announced after that. On other matters, you'll recall that we outlined the process to be followed for considering the New Zealand flag. The first step is the appointment of a cross-party group of MPs, and I'm pleased to provide you today with the membership of that group. The members are David Seymour, representing the ACT Party, Kennedy Graham, representing the Green Party, Trevor Mallard for Labour, Mariama Fox from the Maori Party, Jonathan Young for National, and Peter Dunn for United Future. New Zealand First has chosen not to participate. That doesn't inhibit the process in any way, and the members of the cross-party group will this afternoon have received invitations to their first meeting next week. Time frame is pretty tight, and their first task will be to nominate New Zealanders to serve on the flag consideration panel, which will consider design suggestions and select some to go forward to the first referendum late next year. Just in terms of my activities, this week I'll be in Northland tomorrow, in Wellington on Wednesday and Thursday, and Auckland on Friday.
Given what we know already ahead of the outcome of those inquiries, do you expect that anyone will resign or lose their jobs over Philip Smith?
Look, I wouldn't want to jump in front of the inquiry. In fact, what came out of the discussion that we had at Cabinet today is there are many unanswered questions. There's certainly practices that have been in place for a very long period of time. It crosses some quite delicate issues around, for instance, data sharing and the like. So, you know, let's wait and see. We'll work our way through the inquiry, and in the end it'll make a series of recommendations, I'm sure.
What do you think about those questions?
Sorry?
What do you think are the most pressing of those questions?
Oh, I think there are real questions about whether somebody that, for instance, was incarcerated for a very serious offence, as Mr. Smith was, is able to take these short-term releases without having an electronic monitoring device on him. That's one question. I think there's the real question about data sharing, fundamentally between customs ultimately and corrections, for instance. So, for instance, if someone went to the border and went to leave the country and they had student loan debt, that information would be shared and they'd be stopped, but not for instance, for a conviction. So there's a variety of different things happening there, and we just need to work our way through all of those and ultimately come up with a series of recommendations that fills any deficiencies in the current settings.
Do you believe that a high-risk offender like Philip Smith should be allowed out on temporary release like that without any electronic monitoring?
Well, I think we all can be clever in hindsight. Maybe that always wasn't the case, you know, that technology has developed, but it seems like a pretty simple thing that going forward it would be unacceptable, I would have thought, to let people out who are in that high risk category. There are lots of people that get all sorts of conditions around their release or parole, but we are talking about people in a very high risk category, and I would have thought that sort of person would be monitored 24/7.
What is the government inquiry going to cover that these individual other ones are already covering? So what else do you expect to get out of it?
Well, for a start off, it's the sheer independence of it. So I think New Zealanders will want to know that while on the one hand, you know, departments are carrying out their own inquiry, that in fact actually every stone has been looked under and there haven't been things conveniently left to one side. It certainly will look at any accountability that thinks is appropriate. And it'll also make a series of recommendations, and I suspect when you get into things like data sharing, some of those recommendations might be quite contentious, and the government, if it's going to make changes on the back of this ministerial inquiry, will want to have confidence that we've relied on the best advice done in a way that's independent of those government departments.
So do you trust corrections to carry out its own independent or a robust enough inquiry?
No, I do, but there's about 5 or 6 different agencies that are implicated here in some form or another. And I think as a general rule, while it's extremely important that, for instance, corrections undertakes its own urgent inquiry, I suspect it wouldn't satisfy either the opposition or the public actually if that was the end of the matter.
How long do you expect this inquiry to take?
I genuinely don't know, but these things typically take a bit longer, and it's quite a sort of complex issue because we'll obviously be looking at Philip Smith, but I would have thought in general they'll also be looking at the settings that take place here, and that might require them to broaden out a bit. So we'll come back next week. We have a chance to
Do you have
discuss on
confidence
that.
do you have confidence in your corrections minister?
I do. I have confidence in the ministers. I mean, these practices, from what I can see, have been in place for a very long period of time. I'm sure there'll be lots of information that will be brought to the surface as a result of the inquiries, and we'll be able to analyse those as they go along. But in principle, I think this has been an issue where these holes, in so much that they've existed, have been there for quite a while. But I don't propose to have all the information, but it's resolved the inquiries I will.
Off the back of Philip Smith's release, Samuel Tuanga appeared not to even know the basics of the case and was being interviewed in the day subsequent.
Well, I can't judge that because I wasn't in New Zealand at the time. I had pretty limited access to media inquiry, media coverage over here in New Zealand. But look, in the end, all ministers get judged in the court of public opinion. But I haven't seen anything that would indicate to me that there's a problem.
So that one case would end up with all 5 departments making changes, the whole system being changed.
Well, I would have thought so potentially, because you've got the Justice Department involved. Ultimately, you've got corrections, you've got police, you've got internal affairs. You've got quite a number of different agencies there. And all I'm simply saying is that if the hole in the system, at least in one part, is around the information that's shared at the border, for instance, then that is going to require changes which, I might be wholeheartedly in favour of, and in fact a great many New Zealanders might be, but I'm just saying to you that will challenge some people who will say that it's a breach of privacy and human rights.
If all your ministers were doing their jobs, you wouldn't need this, would you?
No, I don't think that's right. I think this may challenge us to take a step which some people have been reluctant to take. I'm not simply apportioning all the responsibilities there, but this area is an area where there will be plenty of people who I'm sure over the coming months will come out and say that actually privacy should prevail. I think the bulk of New Zealanders would say safety should prevail, and so that's the issue at play here.
Is that a decision that you've already taken, that you expect it to be taken, that information sharing to become much more widespread?
We haven't taken any decisions today, and I don't claim to have all of the information.
Do you expect that?
But what I'm saying is that that is one obvious feature here, that you had a person that was able to go to the border and effectively go across that border and not get stopped because information wasn't shared. That's one factor. There are quite a number of other factors that will need to be debated.
What sort of steps do you think people have been reluctant to take? What are you talking about then? You're talking about toughening up?
Well, there are a great many people that are incarcerated. The question is whether all of that information is shared with border agencies.
Is there a risk that there are other cases like this, people who are incarcerated and have gone through the justice system using unofficial aliases?
In terms of aliases, I can't answer that question. I don't have that answer. I've asked the most obvious question: is there anybody else that could be in the position that Mr. Smith was? The advice I've received is there's nobody that was on or has been on short release that effectively has absconded. The wider issues of whether everybody's met the terms and conditions of their release is a different matter. There may well be people in that category, almost certainly they haven't met all the conditions of their release, but in terms of absconding on a short-term release, there's no one that we're aware of.
How can you be imprisoned under a name that's not your real name?
Well, I can't answer that question for you other than, there's a whole process you go through in terms of how someone is charged and ultimately how they go through that process. Now,
is it done on an honour system?
No, I'm not entirely. I can't answer the question whether corrections and others were aware that there were other names, that this was an alias and he had another name, because people do use other names. I mean, we use the term alias sometimes as if it's an attempt to, for instance, to disguise something. But my understanding of Mr. Smith was that he started using that name when he was 4 years of age. So he's been using that name for a long period of time. But for instance, we know he had a passport under his earlier name, Trainer or whatever it was, that he got when he was 17.
How many breaches were you briefed about in terms of those temporary releases?
I can't give you good answers on that because I don't have good information. But there are lots of people who are in different sort of categories, and it's distilling that down. So, for instance, there are people who are on community service programs that might not fulfil all of their conditions. In terms of very serious issues, there's certainly Mr. Trainer or Mr. Smith is the one that's absconded, but there could be others who are in categories where they haven't met all of their conditions.
What sort of person will run the inquiry?
Well, the options ultimately are either a kind of highly respected New Zealander or a QC. And, a judge, for instance, a QC or a judge, probably the category of type of person, but we haven't identified a person yet.
So you say that there are people out on temporary release or who have been, obviously there's a moratorium now, who could have posed a risk in terms of escaping or not being supervised properly and that sort of thing.
Well, what I'm saying to you is that we've asked corrections to provide us advice on any person that they believe may not have met all of their release conditions and give us an assurance that there's never been any other breach of those, and they can't do that at the moment. What they can do is tell us there hasn't been anybody else who's taken the steps that Mr. Smith took. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who have breached their release conditions, and that's a wider piece of work, and we need to get that.
Why can't they give you those numbers yet?
It's not straightforward. There's a lot of people that get released ultimately in a range of different, there's a lot of people that are incarcerated, and you're talking about a long period of time. I mean, we're not just asking them for today, we're obviously asking historic data.
Broadly speaking, is this new inquiry going to be primarily retrospective, or do you intend it to be a template for future legislation?
Well, I would have thought in broad terms it's going to answer the question, how did Mr. Smith manage to do what he did? That's the first thing. What deficiencies, if any, in the current settings allowed him to undertake the steps that he took? And thirdly, what recommendations should be presented to the government of ways of ensuring it doesn't happen again? That's my guess is where the public would be at.
Given it's been run under the Inquiries Act, does it give you any powers, or is it powers of coercion or requiring information?
It has the full range of powers, I think, under the Inquiries Act.
So would that compare with the departmental ones in terms of being able to pretty much access whatever information it needs?
I think arguably it's much broader actually under the Inquiries Act. They have the power to subpoena and all the like. They have essentially the same powers as within the Inquiries Act you can have a ministerial inquiry or ultimately a royal commission. I mean, ultimately they have under the new Inquiries Act the same powers. They just have different sort of settings and who they report to. So Royal Commission generally goes to the Governor General and they come down from there. But the actual powers of the Act are very broad now. A ministerial inquiry or a departmental inquiry could be quite different. I haven't looked at those terms, so I suspect they're less the less wide ranging.
But this is a ministerial inquiry.
This is a ministerial inquiry
Do you
under
think
the
they'll
Inquiries Act.
take some evidence from Smith?
Look, I can't answer that question.
Just on Roger Sutton, do you think his resignation is appropriate?
Well, firstly, what I would say is it's very much a matter, and it's an employment matter. So I can't arbitrate on the facts of either the complaint or ultimately the findings of the State Services Commissioner. I was aware of the fact that there had been an inquiry undertaken, and I was aware of the top level findings of the State Services Commissioner that there wasn't an intention to dismiss Mr. Sutton, but clearly what's resulted as either as part of this or just generally as a process of reflection is that Mr. Sutton himself has decided that when his contract effectively expires because CERA becomes a departmental agency in February, I think of 2015, that he's not going to reapply.
Is it a blow to CERA? Will it affect its work?
Well, I think he's been a very, very good chief executive in terms of the work that he's done for that organisation. But I can't comment on any other issues that relate to this inquiry. They're quite a different matter. They are the sole domain of the State Services Commissioner, and they've obviously released their findings today.
Is it a big deal if a boss refers to his female staff as sweetie or honey or that kind of thing? Is that a problem in the work?
Well, I think the State Services Commissioner has made it quite clear in a statement today that there are high expectations of a chief executive. And I think that's true whether you're in the public service or the private sector. And obviously that can present a very uncomfortable situation for people and can be deemed as inappropriate. And I think Mr. Sutton himself has made it quite clear, as I understand it, that he does regret some of the actions he's taken. The question is, where that line fits as a result of his actions. And the State Services Commission has decided it doesn't rest on dismissal, but clearly there are things that Mr. Sutton himself has apologised for.
Do you think he's failed to meet the expectations required of chief executives?
It's not for me to judge that. I mean, this is very much an employment matter. I can really only comment on his role as the Chief Executive of CERA, and the interaction I had with him, it was always thoroughly professional and very good.
The G20, did you get any chance to advance the Russia FTA with Mr. Putin?
No, we didn't take that chance. I mean, that chance would always be there at the moment if we want that, because it's pretty clear behind the scenes that the Russian officials do want to advance the FTA, but New Zealand's also made it very clear that that wouldn't fit with our perspective on the actions taken by Russia in Ukraine. It wouldn't be consistent with what our partners are doing, and therefore we don't support an advancement of the FTA, and we won't until we see a change in the view taken by our friends and overseas, and ultimately when they start taking the view that sanctions can be wound back and the position's changing, then yes, New Zealand will respond to that as well, but not before that point.
Making that concrete, what would he have to do in order for New Zealand to feel it could advance the FTA and take it off ice?
Well, I think the rest of the Western world would need to feel as though he was not putting the pressure on the situation in Ukraine that we find ourselves in.
What would be evidence of that?
Well, you've seen some of that in terms of his military build-up on the borders of Ukraine.
No, the evidence of goodwill on his part.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I saw him make some comments through the media on the way out from G20 where he seemed to indicate the position was going to slightly change. I think a lot of people will be very sceptical about that.
Do you
Alongside
think
the
New
airports,
Zealand's position on the Korea FTA vis-a-vis dairy will empower Japan in the TPP talks? I mean, aren't you signalling that you are prepared to go suboptimal on dairy?
No, I think in the end we're indicating that we have taken the very best deal that we can, and there's a degree of pragmatism about that. There are some reforms in dairy, and outside of dairy there's pretty much very wide-ranging reforms. Now, of course, yes, we could have taken the view that said that we wouldn't progress the FTA because milk powders were left with only minor reductions, but that would have had a tremendous impact on every other sector in New Zealand, like kiwi fruit and meat and various other products. So in the end, I mean, I don't think any FTA is perfect. They always have some imperfections. I don't think in the case of you can translate necessarily what happens in an FTA with Korea in terms of what the settings of TPP will be. But even if you look at those broader ones in terms of the dairy sector, while milk powders are out, infant baby formula is 100% in, butter and cheeses are all in. So it's really only milk powder. And frankly, as I said, we had to balance up whether that was worth walking away from what is a very significant trading partner.
The Federated Farmers' view in their press release was that it's better than nothing, and the tenor of it was, this is the bottom line, nothing should be worse than this in terms of free trade deals. Can you give Federated Farmers an assurance that TPP won't be worse?
No, I can't give them any assurance because I don't know ultimately what the end state of TPP looks like. What I can give them and every other New Zealander an assurance of is that we'll negotiate the very best deal we can, and in the end we won't sign a deal unless we believe it's in New Zealand's best interests. But very few FTAs have absolute perfection, and actually if that's the way they're representing the Korean New Zealand FTA, then they're actually underselling, I think, the quality of that deal, because yes, it has some issues around deer velvet, and yes, it doesn't include the bulk of milk powder, but everything else in that sector and their sector is in, and it's a very big deal. I mean, if this is a market we're paying well over $200 million worth of tariffs, 65 million of them disappear overnight as a result of the deal. Go and ask the kiwi fruit growers of New Zealand whether they could carry on competing when they were paying such enormous tariffs going into the Korean market. And the answer is no.
But you're the ones who have highlighted the importance of TPP to dairy. It's not us, it's you, and you look like you might buckle on it.
No, what we've always said is that, or and certainly in recent times the Trade Minister has said, is that New Zealand's a lone voice on dairy because we're one of the very few major exporters in dairy. So of course we find ourselves, and often do find ourselves, in a position where we're negotiating where others have very little interest in that particular product category. My own view is that you can't read one deal against another, because if you want to do that, then you could say, but CER allows this, or I don't know, the China FTA allows this. I mean, they're all different and they all have different characteristics. But what I can tell you is that we got the same conditions as Europe, the United States, Australia and Canada, and these were hard-fought negotiations, and we were never going to get any better than we got.
So if you're in Japan, if you're in Japan and you're being pressured to cave in on dairy, why wouldn't you look at this situation and see that New Zealand isn't prepared to go to the wall on this?
Well, firstly, don't forget there are reductions in the tariffs on dairy. Secondly, if you're Japan, dairy is probably not the big thing that you're really fighting over, because you're talking about milk powders and how much in the way of milk powders that Japan buys from us. I don't have those exact details, but they buy a lot of butter and cheese and infant baby formula and other products. So yes, of course we want to get 100% milk powders, but it's one subcategory in the overall dairy category, and the other categories are getting very good elimination.
Alongside the Air Force chiefs, are there any other representatives from defence or intelligence agencies in New Zealand at the moment?
Yeah, so there's as I understand it, a meeting that's taking place in Queenstown. There are the 5 chiefs of Air Force of the Five Eyes partners, so Canada and the United States, United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand. Meetings have been held, I think, since 2011's first time we posted it, as I understand.
So did they arrive on a plane that's parked up at Wellington, the US?
Is there a US plane out there? Yep, well, the US contingent would have, yeah.
And outside of the Air Force, are there any other representatives from the other?
I don't know every person there, but my understanding is it's an Air Force meeting. It's not an intelligence meeting. They are the same partners as we are in the Five Eyes with, but the Chief of Airs.
And it's a scheduled meeting?
Well, they have it every so often, and yep, we've been going to them, and just happens to be this is our turn to host it.
88 New Zealanders have had their passports cancelled since 2012.
Yep.
How many of them have had connections to Syria?
Can't answer that question. I don't know. I'm sorry. I can possibly.
DIA is refusing to release information on grounds of national security.
Yep.
Should Parliament have that information before they consider the legislation next week?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've given the political parties, or the major political parties, a briefing on that matter. They are one category of person that we are concerned about, obviously concerned enough to cancel their passport. But in the end, actually, the set of conditions that we are looking Parliament to pass in a pretty short space of time is quite narrow and actually far less aggressive than what you're seeing in a lot of other countries. So Australia has been taking much broader steps. Canada indicated to us they're going to do the same. I think the United Kingdom's looking at the same. So, you know, I kind of think the settings we've got it about right.
David Shearer says that Labor prefer to know the scope of the problem, and without that information being provided, they can't make that judgment.
Well, we've given them briefings, confidential briefings, through their officials, and we're happy to continue to give them those briefings. I don't think it really makes any difference if we say exactly who the name is, although in confidence, you know, it might be possible for them to know their name. It's a bit irrelevant. Well, that might be possible, but in the end, that you've got to remember the legal test to cancel a passport is a high hurdle, and it's one where the person has the right of appeal through a judicial process. So I would have thought the question isn't, you know, their connection with Syria or their name. The question is the test set in the right place? They can observe that for themselves today. It's probably a pretty similar test to when they were in office. I don't think it's changed, but I'd have to have a look. And in the end, actually, as you can see, we're quite conservative about that.
Of the people on the watch list, the 30 to 40 or on the to be investigated watch list, are many of them women?
I can't answer that question. I just don't know. I'm sorry.
Chief Palmer has done a review of the anti-smacking laws and found it's criminalising good parents. Does that concern you?
I haven't seen the whole report. I've seen a summary of it. What I'd say is that's not consistent with the findings of the police. I don't think that's consistent with the findings of most New Zealanders. I mean, the reality is that we've had the law for a long period of time now. I think the parents that are getting convicted under the law are doing so because they breached the threshold and therefore they should be prosecuted. And in my view, actually, the country had the opportunity to test that because there was a political party that actually went to the 2014 election with smacking as one of its core policy planks, and they didn't make the 5% threshold. So, for the most part, the number of people that have been prosecuted have been very small, and I actually think the law's set in about the right place.
David Cameron has made some comments after the G20 saying he's very concerned about the global economic outlook. So we're talking about GFC 2.0. Do you have particular concerns there? Do you have officials on alert for signs of financial instability? The
head of the IMF gave a presentation to the G20, and what she indicated was that global growth next year is likely to be 3.8%. That's consistent with the average growth rate in the global economy for the last 25 years. I mean, I think what David Cameron is responding to is that European growth is unquestionably slowing down. And it's actually slowing down bluntly because of what's happening in Ukraine. So German growth, which has been running at about 2%, has been downgraded to, I think, 1.2% this year and 1.3% next year. And a fair bit of that is the impact of Ukraine. But actually, if you look at it globally, you've still got reasonably strong growth in Asia. Certainly China is still likely to print something around about 7.5%. And actually US growth has been a little stronger. So I think there are always risks in the global economy. And there's no question that if there was significant conflict in the Middle East or significant conflict in Eastern Europe, either of those issues, could have a dramatic impact on global growth. But overall, I think generally we're in much better shape than we were 4 or 5 years ago.
But our bank's just had a surprise return to recession and is signalling he's going to call an election, so there are some concerns out there that weren't necessarily known even at the G20 meeting.
Well, RBA's had a mixture of economic data. So his Q1 numbers were very strong, but his Q2 numbers, I think, from memory, were surprisingly negative. If he has a snap election, in part it's because, of course, don't forget, he's got legislation on the books which increases the equivalent of his GST from 8% to 10%. And one assumes that would be because he would be testing that, I suppose. But look, in the end, it's ultimately a matter for them.
But the growth story in Japan's not good at the moment.
Well, it looks like their overall number is about 1%, and that's lower than what they would hope. But in the end, actually, bluntly, for Japan to grow, he needs to fire the third arrow. And the third arrow is about structural reform of the Japanese economy, including trade liberalisation, which is TPP.
Just on the FTA with Korea, are you confident that the Korean Parliament will pass that?
I think you're in for plenty of challenges, bluntly. They've been doing that and certainly kicking the tyres pretty hard on the Australian and Canadian FTAs. And there'll be quite a pushback from the agricultural sector because I think, despite what Federated Farmers might say, it's actually a really good deal for New Zealand. It's consistent with what they've done with the other FTAs, but nevertheless, it's a good thing for New Zealand. But I think in the end they will pass it, but it'll be a hard-fought campaign.
Not a done deal yet, then?
Well, we're feeling very confident about it. The President wants to pass it. There's a lot of goodwill towards New Zealand. I think we'll get there.
Just beyond the sort of exchange of pleasantries and symbolic kind of gestures, any sort of hard sort of business you're hoping to advance during the Chinese President's visit?
There's one or two things we might want to talk about when the President's here, so we'll just save that for a couple of days. But I mean, overall, I wouldn't underestimate the fact that he's coming here. I mean, for a start off, there's only a certain amount of time, and he's the President of China, and he's chosen to come to New Zealand. I mean, the symbolism of that, given I've been to China 5 times in the last 5 years, is a very powerful message that China sees New Zealand as an important partner, and particularly an important economic partner. And I think that they'll be taking quite a big delegation of ministers, and I think probably economic people with them, business people, and that sends a very strong signal. So there's only a limit to the number of announceables, but there might be 1 or 2 things that we can talk about when he's here. No pandas, I'm afraid. No.
Did anyone try and dissuade you from joining the infrastructure bank when you were at APEC or G20?
No, our officials are going to be in China, I think, on Friday, continuing to look at the structure. And I think we would say, that they've identified the right issue, which is infrastructure, shortfall or deficit in Asia, and actually working alongside China and the other 20-odd partners is, potentially, a worthy initiative. But there'll be a range of views. I mean, there'll be some countries that will be waiting to take more time. Maybe some won't join, but we'll see how New Zealand finally settles on the matter. We haven't made a decision yet.
What's the downside for New Zealand?
Probably relatively little. I mean, I think the main issue is if we're to go into AIIB, we would have to be just confident of the fact that we have enough control and that the processes that are being followed are the appropriate ones. So, I mean, obviously it's a lot of money, and it's New Zealand's name on the ticket, just in the same way it is with ADB or IMF. And so we just want to be sure that it's structured in a way where we have the appropriate rights.
Have you received any advice on when we're likely to see the CAA investigation of Gerry Brownlee?
Within the next 48 hours.
SAS troops, you have said, obviously, up until yesterday that they're unlikely to go to Iraq in a combat role, but that seems to have changed now.
No, it hasn't changed. They won't go in a combat role. I've ruled that out, and that's the position. I'm pretty sure I said at the time when I gave the security speech is ultimately, if we undertake training in Iraq, we'll need to provide as part of that training our own security for the perimeter of that training place. And the question is, who provides that, that work? One option is just, skilled army people. There's plenty of those that don't have to be SAS, but obviously SAS could do that, and they're very skilled. So it's possible that we could have a few people in that category, or some SAS there. They would have to be, but they won't be out there in a combat role or the sort of accompanying role that we saw them undertake when they were with the CRU in Afghanistan.
So even in a protective role, they would also still be behind
They'd be
the
behind the wire. They go, stay within the perimeter. I mean, that's the sort of standard position. If you went to the training facility that we have with the Brits in Afghanistan at the moment, that's exactly the case. Obviously, you've got to protect your own training people.
Have you seen the CA report into Gerry Brownlee?
Have I seen it?
Yeah.
No, but I'm aware of it.
You're aware of what's
I'm aware of the findings, yeah.
Has it been released to coincide with the Labour leadership announcement tomorrow?
No, but Mr. Brownlee was advised today, and so I'm sure there'll be a statement tomorrow.
So
You're
if it's
expecting
tomorrow,
her to
does
be
it
a
go
minister on Wednesday?
Look, we'll leave all that till tomorrow, and the CIA should release their own report. I'm just being, under no surprises, made aware of the findings.
So you know enough about it to have made a decision about his
Yep.
future?
I do.
Just a simple coincidence that it's on the same day as the Labour Commission.
Well, don't forget, it's got nothing to do with us. I mean, we're actually amazed that it's taken as long as it has. I mean, it's 2 months since the election. So you can ask them your own questions to that. Yesterday, we don't have any control. I literally just got informed this morning that they had gone to Mr. Brownlee to give them the findings, given he's the person that's involved, and on the back of that, we'll see where it goes from there.
Are you still expecting Gerry Brownlee to be a minister by the end of the week?
You just asked the same question they asked. As I said, I'll comment on all of that tomorrow.
Have you spoken to Minister Brownlee yet?
I have, yes.
Encouraged by Andrew's question, what about the Lester Chisholm inquiry and the Cheryl Gwynn inquiries? Have they been completed? Have you seen them? When might we
I haven't seen either of those, and I'm not a party to those, so ultimately I'll get them when I suspect I'll get them anyway. The point at which they're completed and on a no surprises basis, but I haven't seen either of those. I don't know the status of them at this point.
So you said earlier you have confidence in your ministers.
Yeah, I have all the confidence in my ministers today.
Does that extend to Gerry Brownlee?
Today?
Today you do. So does
Hey.
that mean he's gone after tomorrow?
No, not necessarily.
But you still have
Wait until
confidence.
tomorrow.
You
But
still
you
have
know what the
confidence in
findings are.
you still have confidence.
Yeah, I know what the
in
findings are,
report.
but I'm not going to give you the answers today. The Civil Aviation are going to release their report tomorrow, and when they do, I will be more than happy to talk to you about it.
But you still have confidence in him off the back of what you learned this morning.
Yeah, but you can't go and read into all that sort of stuff. Wait till tomorrow, and you'll see the report, and you'll see my response. See you later.